Dave Ingram. That's me. You don't care. You just have to care what I have to say today. So if you do want to follow me on Twitter, there it is. I work mostly by myself. I do contract work. I've been doing Drupal for about 5 years or so, and debugging is a major part of what I do because I write a lot of code. I do a lot of custom modules and things like that. So some of what I am going to be talking about has saved me countless hours and gotten me the work that I've gotten because it's extremely useful things. So I hope to just pass on some of those pieces. So I got this number from different places. It doesn't really matter if it's correct, but I can speak from personal experience. When you're writing code, not necessarily working with just patching modules together, but when you get into writing code or doing sort of more advanced development, what you get into is you write what you think is going to work, and then you run it and it doesn't work, and then the rest of your day is spent trying to figure out why it doesn't work. I think I see some heads nodding, so there's some people who have written some code there, and I put a link there. This is where I got this number from. I think it was actually 49.9%. I was going to put the number higher, but it probably depends on what you're doing.
It is higher.
Yeah, you think it's higher? It probably just depends on what you're doing and what you're working on. But anyway, there's a lot of time, regardless, spent on figuring out why the heck this thing doesn't work. And of course, in the Drupal world, we're also working a lot of times with all the time with other people's code. And how many have the experience of downloading a module and then thinking it's going to do what you want, and then it doesn't work at all? Or maybe it works for some use cases and it doesn't quite work for your use case. So having the tools available to you to be able to dive into somebody else's code and actually understand what's going on is extremely valuable. And this is something that saved my hide more than once. So that's like really close, but it's just not quite there. And then either being able to contribute that back, or you don't ever hack core, but sometimes you got to hack a contributed module to get what you need, and so sometimes that's the case. And so what we're going to be talking about is basically the tools to be able to get in there, figure out why your own code doesn't work, or figure out why somebody else's code doesn't work. And going further, if you want to go back into contributing more to the Drupal community, being able to work on other people's code, being able to understand it, being able to work on Drupal core, especially we're going to get into step debugging. That has been extremely helpful for me in beginning to understand sort of Drupal's hook systems and how Drupal actually works. If you look at the tens of thousands of lines of code, I don't know how many lines of code it is, but it's a lot of lines of code. If you look at that, it's just overwhelming, but if you can start to go through it line by line, okay, it's a lot of lines, but it starts to make sense. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So I basically have 3 sections I'm dividing this into, and we'll get into each one of those. But we're going to be, the third one is going to be step through debugging, and I've got some time at the end to go into that because that's really critical, but I don't want to spend too much time on that because it's not always the right tool for every situation. Sometimes you can waste a lot of time there. So we're going to have sort of 3 sets of tools that we're going to look at for doing your debugging and talk a little bit about why you might want each one. So this is just in preparation. This isn't actually one of my steps. It didn't seem to fit. But the first thing that you want to do is stop and think about your problem. Sometimes if you have lots of tools available to you, your first thing, like I've done this before, my first thing in a problem was jump into my step debugger and start going through line by line of code, and then realize after like 3 hours of stepping through lines of code that I forgot to turn a module on. And so stop and work through your what you've done a little bit. I put a few things on here: divide and conquer, or basically split your problem into pieces. We have lots of things. It's not necessarily going to be a line of code. If you've got, for example, you've got your Apache server running. Did something change there? You've got maybe something changed on your PHP configuration. Maybe you just turned on a module and you didn't mean to, or simple things to go back even further, how many people have spent more than an hour working on a problem and it turns out that they just hadn't flushed their cache? Yeah, so, before you go way into that, I've done the same thing many a time, and I've done it before. I was trying to launch some changes onto a production server, and it wasn't working, and the client's saying, what's going on here? And I spent, I don't even want to say how much time, I'm not sure I remember, and we'll just leave it at that, but spent lots of time trying to debug that problem, and turns out I hadn't reverted a feature or something like that, and something really basic. So first thing is, stop and think, what's involved, what changed recently, if you're working with somebody else, what might they have changed that's doing something that it shouldn't do, and work through it a little bit more systematically in your head before you start diving into too many different tools and waste lots of time. And the debugging essentially is just, there's always some problem. It can be overwhelming sometimes because you're dealing with so many things, but there's always some small problem. Usually it's a really small problem. Sometimes that really small problem takes a long time and you banging your head on the table, and then it's something really simple. So take your time and think through the problem is basically the point of this before diving into tools. But I know you want to hear about tools. So one more foundational thing that we want to talk about first is you want to have certain things in place ahead of time, and you will benefit very much by having this. First is version control, that divide and conquer what changed kind of question I was just talking about. If you have your code in version control and you're committing that code on a regular basis, don't wait 5 days before you make a commit after every rational change. Git makes that very easy and friendly to do. And then if something breaks, you can easily go back in and work through what actually happened. You can step back through. Git has some nice tools. I won't go into that because that's not really what the talk's about. But that's just something you want to have. The other thing you want to have anytime you're messing up with or messing around with something, you want to have a lot of regular database backups. You go in and start debugging, throwing code into things, or just realize something broke recently and you want to get that fixed. If you have a regular set of database backups before something gets broken, that's a really good thing, because if your last database backup was from 2 weeks ago and you've made lots of changes and then you realize, oops, I just broke something and I don't know what that was, sometimes your best bet is go back to where it was working and then work your way forward rather than trying to work your way back and undo something. So you want to have that in place. It's not really debugging, but I feel like that's really important. And then the other thing is your development environment. We've probably all done it, but you don't ever want to do something directly on your production environment. I won't ask for a show of hands, but you don't want to go in and something's broken and start messing around on your production environment, because you can either break something even worse and not know how to get that back or whatever else. It's just a problem. So what you want to have is a development environment, probably a staging environment. That's a topic for another discussion sometime, but you want to have a development environment that at least relatively closely mirrors your production environment, same versions of PHP at least, and same major versions of MySQL. There's just weird stuff that can happen sometimes, and you want to, I could tell stories there again too, but you want to have something that's pretty close. There was a talk on Vagrant earlier today. That's a really nice way to set up lots of virtual servers, so that's one option. But basically you want to have something that's pretty close to what you're working on production that you can work on. You can grab a copy of your database and pull it over into your development environment and start debugging there if you have a problem on your live site, which hopefully you don't. Hopefully you're discovering it just while you're doing the developing, but that is what it is. And I don't think I have a slide on that, but you want to learn to be able to do all of these things really quickly. These are important tools. If you haven't taken the time to learn Git and to learn Drush, oh, I said the magic word. So anybody who does not know Drush, or is kind of just starting. I mean, that's I saw 3.
I'm nervous.
He was first.
Okay. You gotta send that back. So Drush is a really, really useful tool for being able to do these things. Things like, one of the most useful is just to grab a database backup really quickly. Don't mess with any of that PHP my admin kind of stuff. It's horrible for databases unless your database is like the stock database with no content, then you can handle it. But otherwise, trying to do that in the browser is just a pain. There's the backup migrate module. It's an amazing module, but it's a little bit slow. It's not. It's really good for what it is. But if you can do it in Drush, do it in Drush, and you can do it in Drush. Just take a little bit of time to learn it. And so being able to dump that and restore it real quickly, so you can sort of rerun your process multiple times to get competent with that skill is really useful in debugging. If you're making a lot of changes in the database, then definitely you want to be doing that. And get real familiar with Git so that you can roll back and roll forward in your code. Things like, as far as figuring out what changed, especially if you're working with other developers, tools in Git, which again is another talk, but things like git blame and git diff to see what changed between the different the different commits. Again, commit often so that doesn't get ridiculous, but if you can see what's actually changed between, oh yeah, I did this yesterday, and those are the lines of code, that's a really useful one. So enough of that, let's get on to some of the specific debugging tools I wanted to talk about. So the first, I call these core tools. The first 3 are actually just PHP, and then the last one is in Drupal core, but this is without any contrib modules. It's just stuff you have available to you. If you're already running Drupal, you have this. So printr and vardump are basically the same thing. They display output a little bit differently. You can try both. I find printr a little bit easier to read. Vardump gives you a little bit more information sometimes. So these are core PHP. You can do it in any PHP. And you can basically throw anything into there and it will output that on the screen for you, and it will be extremely useful. It can be difficult to read, and we're going to get into some more specific tools that makes that easier, but you want to know what these are. And essentially, you can throw, if you're trying to do forms, you can throw an entire form array into one of these and it'll output, and you can look through it. You can put objects in there, you can put strings in there, you can put anything you want in there, and it'll tell you what it is. And basically, if you're working through code, you want to know what's in variables. We'll talk about a number of ways to do that, but this is sort of the bare minimum basic way of doing that, of debugging, so you want to know about that. Another PHP command, the third one on here, is debug backtrace, and what that's going to give you is what's called a call stack, which is wherever it got ran from, whatever function, it will tell you what function called that function, what function called that function, what function called that function. In Drupal, there's usually about 15 up by the time you actually run that in any of your code. But as far as being able to trace back to where a problem actually was, that can be extremely useful. You've probably seen those before. If you got just like a random PHP error pop up on your screen, that's often on there. And you never necessarily know exactly where the error was unless it tells you something really useful. It's sometimes in multiple levels of that, so you want to have that available, and I'll give you another way to display that in a few minutes. And then the other sort of core Drupal debugging tool, which you've all used and not necessarily known that you've used, is watchdog. That's what comes up in the recent log messages when any kind of errors that you see in there. Lots of core uses it, lots of contributed modules use that. So in that sense, when you start to have problems, you want to check that log, because sometimes there's something that's been written out for you really nicely as to exactly what your problem is. And I've spent a lot of time debugging something before I checked that log and then realized, oh, that's what that was. Another thing that I didn't put on this slide, but the other things you want to check is, for example, your Apache error log. which will tell you any PHP errors. If you might have your site set up to display that on the screen, but if you don't, you might be getting PHP errors and warnings in your Apache error log, which is in different places, depending on your system. But you can just Google that and find out where that is and look in there at the bottom. That can be a really useful thing too. So check the logs that are already there before you start generating your own to figure out what's going on, and you might find the problem really quickly before you start diving through hundreds of lines of code. So threw this up there. I learned this from a guy a while back, and this has been really useful to me in the past. I'm going to put these slides up so you don't have to necessarily put all of this down, but basically watchdog can only, when you put that log in there, it can only take a string. And very often you want more than a string if you're trying to debug what's happening. And watchdog turns out to be really useful for things like if you're trying to debug other users using your site, that you just want stuff logged somewhere. If you're doing something on a testing site or something like that, you probably don't want to use this extensively on production, but you could if you had to. But if you want to throw just some kind of a variable in there, an object in there, figure out why your form array is doing something different, then this is a really neat function you can use. I don't know if this is up in a module somewhere. It doesn't matter. I'm just putting that there. I'll put this code up somewhere. It doesn't matter what you call it. I just called it Advanced Watchdog because that seemed like something to call it. But basically all this is doing is taking this var dump here and saving it into a string. This is output buffering right here. It's a handy little trick that basically stops anything from being output and to the screen and captures it in a thing called an output buffer, and then this thing gets it back out into a string, and then you throw it into the message and then call Drupal's watchdog, and then that will let you throw a pre-formatted array into watchdog, and it's kind of a handy trick I learned at some point.
I'm trying not to interrupt you, but
go ahead.
Instead of OB start and OB clean, you just do print R with the second flag of 1, and it'll put it in a print R array for you.
Okay. I think I've seen that as well. And there's something that's in a var dump that's not in a print R, and I'm trying to remember.
I'm sure there is.
I think there's, because you can't do that with a var dump, I think, but that's true. There's a
var export that does the same thing. You pass it 1 or true at the end, and it does the same thing. It just returns it rather than dumping it.
Okay. So don't use this. There's other ways. But the concept of, how basically the idea is, how do I get the information that I want in a place that I can go back and look at it later? That's the idea. So this is one way to get at that, and maybe it's not the best way. That's not a problem. Yeah.
So if you do a var dump on an object, it'll tell you like if it's a string, its length. Whereas print R will just tell you what's in it.
Yeah. Doesn't it tell you if it's a string or an object?
It will tell you if it's a string.
Yeah.
If an element of, like if a member of an object is a string, it'll tell you it's a string or
okay.
Int.
So it gives so var export or var dump or var export gives you a little bit more information, but it can be a little bit harder to read as well. So anyway, then replace those 3 lines with var export message. And then stick it there or whatever, however you do it. Getting objects into watchdog can be handy. So let's move on to some contributed modules. The first one, probably I'm talking debugging. Anyone guess what module? Devel Module, of course. Oh wait, but I still have that could have been a question, but since I was talking about like pure PHP stuff, anybody who's like interested in, like you're using Drupal and you don't really know PHP MySQL and you're very interested in it, I think your hand went up first, and that should be a pretty handy book for.
I promise I have to put it in my office.
It's a yeah, keep it hidden. But no, that should be a really good book for that. But I do recommend that. I mean, if you're sort of playing with Drupal and you want to get a little bit deeper into it, at some point it's really helpful to just learn more PHP. more MySQL so that you can, especially if you're trying to understand other people's code and all that, at some point it becomes very useful. So the one that I use, this is like my default go-to function, DPM variable. What that does is put that print R that we were talking about, it puts the output of that into the messages section of your website in a clickable format that you can expand things and collapse things and get a lot of really useful information. It's much easier to understand than the huge, like, can be pages long. If you're doing some of the nested arrays in Drupal, that's a really handy thing. DVM does basically, well, it also sticks things in the messages area as a var dump, but it doesn't do the whole nice collapsed thing. So if you want the extra information in var dump, that can be somewhat helpful. Another one I don't use real often because you can just do it in a couple lines in DPM, but I would use it more often if I thought about it, is the dargs function. And that will give you the same collapsible information that's in DPM. It'll give you all of the arguments that are in a function. So if you're doing something like a hook form alter and you're trying to, you want to look at your form, you want to look at your form state, you want to look at whatever else got passed into there, you'd have to write out DPM form state, and then when you want to take it out, you comment it and all of that. So if you just do dargs, no parameters, throw it in there, and it'll give you each one of those right there, and that's just extremely useful. Yes?
I'm going to show my ignorance a little bit, but you're putting all these in a PHP, you're using these commands in PHP.
Yes, this is going to be in, if you're working on a module or trying to, you can, some of these places is not necessarily a recommended thing, but of course there's places in Drupal interface where you can put PHP code.
Right,
you can throw it anywhere that PHP code will be read, and it can be very useful. But it's going to be, typically in a module or in a in your theme. If you're trying to debug something in your theme, of course you can use it there as well.
Since you mentioned thing, I'm just going to mention it.
Sure.
You got to be careful with DPM. If you're doing that in the theme layer, it doesn't come up right away, and that's the use case to use print Rs.
For
The
the
DPM comes too late in the process
Okay.
if you're debugging the theme layer.
right.
Wait, you refresh, and then it'll come the second time, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it'll come again. So yes, thank you. I see. I knew there was a reason for putting in var dump and print R in there. That's the other. There's also two other iterations of this. If you swap the M for an R, you get a digital video recorder for the second one, and for both of them, you get the same output at the very top of your page instead of in the messages section. And if you happen to be working on a theme that doesn't have the messages section set up, which sometimes if you're setting up a new theme or something like that, it hasn't been set up, or sometimes you're working on somebody else's theme and they just chose not to. Or if you're working on one of those themes that uses one of those modules that puts all the messages in this little thing that flashes and then turns off after 5 seconds, that'll be kind of hard to scan through your whole var dump in 5 seconds. So anyway, those swap out the M for an R, and then you get that at the top, and that can be a little bit more useful sometimes as well. DD is extremely useful for things where you might want to use watchdog, and that's like if you're, well, you might want to use it for all kinds of things because then you have that information available. But this is going to write whatever you throw into there, instead of printing it to the screen, it's going to print it to a text file that you can then search through that text file. And that text file will be in the temporary directory of your Drupal site. And it's called Drupal debug.txt, I think. And yes, I put that on the slide. It's called Drupal debug.txt. And so that's really useful if you're ever working with something like web services or something that's asynchronous and you don't have direct access to it, or you want to just get back to something later. That's a really handy function. And then debug backtrace does exactly the same thing as debug backtrace, except it prints it in the, I think it's at the top of the screen, not in the messages area, but it gives you that same information as a debug backtrace. It just makes it easier to stick it on the page or you want. So that can be a handy little function to know as well. So another contributed module, anybody use Drupal for Firebug? A little bit. I honestly, I don't use this in my day-to-day work, but I wanted to throw it in there because it's pretty cool. It only, of course, works with Firebug because it's Drupal for Firebug, so that only works with Firefox, or maybe it works with Firebug Lite. I haven't actually ever tried that, but I think it only works on Firefox. And I actually have that running on here, so we can do a quick demo of it when we get to demo time. But basically, you have this, if anybody uses Firebug, this should all look familiar, and then you got, bam, Drupal tab. And then you have all these tabs up here where you can see all kinds of really useful information. For example, this is a print R statement, which we were talking about, of all of the forms that are on this page. I happened to, before I grabbed a screenshot, click on the Forms tab. And then you see that right there, and it does it every time that you run that page, but it doesn't mess up your theme because it outputs it to Firebug instead. So that can be really handy, and it does the same thing for your nodes and for your users and for your views. So it's a pretty cool thing to have around, and it also lets you execute PHP. I think you have to have the Devel module running for some of this. You do have to get the Drupal for Firebug module and the Drupal for Firebug extension, but if you go to that link, it all installs real easily, and you have to enable the module. And it's a handy thing to have, and for some people, might really be the way to go, especially if you're doing a lot of work on forms on the site and you don't want to keep going in and typing the dargs in every single place, things like that. It's a handy thing to have in your tools, and it could be, I know a lot of people, I don't know how many people, I know some people love working with this module. I have no idea how many, so I won't say, but it's handy to have. That's all I'm gonna say about that one. And now we're going to move on to the step debugger, which I said I would talk about. Anybody in here work with a step debugger on a regular basis? A couple of you. Anybody tried to set one up but not successfully? Okay. Anybody? So a bunch of people never used one at all?
Well, never for, I haven't really thought about how to use it with PHP and like Vim, but if I used to use IDEs and stuff, it's really easy with like Java and
right.
Eclipse or whatever, just like built right in.
Okay. Yeah, so you can do pretty much the same thing with PHP and Drupal, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So there's basically 3 parts to making this work, and it can get a little bit confusing when you're trying to set this up, and it can be tricky, and you can find all kinds of information on that. Basically, you only have 3 things. You have your PHP installation, which if you have Drupal running, you've got that. Xdebug, you might have running already. If you're using anything like MAMP or WAMP or DAMP or any AMP stack, they often come with that. If not, depending on your operating system, there's different ways to install that. And basically, that's an extension for PHP, which runs a process that listens for things to be activated on your page. And so you need that set up. There's also other ones. There's like a Zen debugger. I'm not going to talk about any of the other ones because I've only ever used Xdebug, so I wouldn't know what I was talking about if I talked about other ones. But I think that's the one most people use with PHP stuff. So you need PHP, you need Xdebug, and then you need some kind of an IDE which will be able to run your debugging process. There's a bunch of them. I'm going to be demonstrating in PHP Storm. They did not pay me any money, and it's a paid product, so I'm not really advertising that, but it does happen to be a really good IDE that I like. There's another one called Eclipse. It's open source, it's free. I know a lot of people use that. I used it a long time ago and didn't like it as much as some other ones, so I don't use it, but I know a lot of people love Eclipse, so that's very much an option. And there's even an extension for V or Vim, where you can do it all in the console, and I've used it in the past. It's sometimes nice to be able to use your mouse to click through things, but if you're the kind of die-hard console person that just has to code in Vim, You can impress all your friends by setting up your step-through debugger in Vim, and then you've got your coder, and then you've got like, it breaks into 3 different windows, and you can step through, and it works pretty nicely. Yeah.
Just a word, Emacs.
Emacs. And it's can you do Xdebug in Emacs? I'm sure you can. You can do everything in Emacs. So and there's also, I mean, there's probably lots more. I'm not trying to give preference to these. I'm just throwing a few up there. The point is, you need an IDE that can do step-through debugging. There's also Komodo and lots of other ones that I'm sure are very good. I don't mean to offend anyone by just having 3 icons up here. It's just, you need an IDE. You should just put IDE on there. Okay. So this website has access to every single tutorial on how to set up Xdebug. I'm being facetious. Don't write it down. This is let me Google that for you. And that will do a Google search for you. So there's no way that I can talk about every single type of configuration for setting up Xdebug on Windows and not that I would know because I've only done it on a certain set of systems, but you do need to get Xdebug set up, you do need to get an IDE set up, and depending on if you're on Windows, Mac, or Linux, it's going to be slightly different depending on your, if you use something like MAMP for Mac, or that actually comes with Xdebug, kind of pre-configured. I know the Drupal stack installer from Acquia comes with Xdebug. You have to, I think, do a little bit of configuring. But if you put in, if you're on Windows and you're trying to use Eclipse and you're trying to debug PHP, you put in Windows, Xdebug, PHP configuration, and there's a very high chance you're going to get a tutorial on where the correct location of the files are and things like that. And it does vary from IDE to IDE. It's a little bit complicated. There's one thing that I do want to talk about on configuration because I found this personally very useful and I haven't seen it written very many places. There's a lot of, this is just in your php.ini file, and that's, it's thousands of lines. This is usually right at the bottom if you have something pre-set up with that. And there's a whole bunch of different configuration options. This actually is directly, except for that comment right there, it's directly from my php.ini. I don't have any other statements in there. Sometimes there's a list of like 20 that you should configure. And for me, the defaults happen to all work really well. The important one for sort of turning it on is this remote enable. That's what everyone will tell you to do. That basically turns on the ability to do remote debugging with Xdebug. I didn't mention this before, but there's local debugging and remote debugging. And what you're going to want to do with Drupal is remote debugging. It doesn't matter if everything's on your same system or not. What local debugging would do is you're basically just starting your debugger from a specific line. And Drupal, that's almost always meaningless because you don't have the context of a call from the browser. So starting it locally doesn't make any sense. So what you want is the browser to be able to start it, and that's what remote enable allows you to do, is to turn on remote debugging. Now this remote auto start, I haven't seen anybody write about that. I don't think. I just found it in the documentation. But one of the things, actually I probably should put this slide afterwards, but this allows you to, let's see, no, okay. I don't know where, maybe I took that slide out. But one of the steps that you have to do usually, and most people will talk about this, is you have to either put in an Xdebug auto something, I don't know what the query string is, but you have to put in a query string, or you have to use a browser extension that'll do that for you to basically tell the browser to tell your IDE to activate the debugger. If you do this remote auto start, you can cut out that whole step, and it will just, every time you make a call to your local system, it will try to start the debugger if it's turned on and there's a breakpoint, which we'll talk about in a few minutes as well. But anyway, that cuts out some steps. It can be inconvenient too, so this might not be right for everybody. But what this does do, I think the time that I found this was when I was trying to debug something with like services or something with JavaScript, something that was like I wasn't directly making that call from my browser, and I know there are other ways to get this to activate, but it was always tricky, so I turned this on and then it just always started it for me, and I could debug any PHP code anytime, and it made me happy. It might not make you happy, but it was a very nice find for me, so I put that on there. Checking that your Xdebug is enabled and working. This is just the PHP info call that you can do from a PHP file. You see that in a lot of places, but this is a really handy thing. If you scroll down, again, I think it's alphabetized, so just jump to the bottom and scroll up a little bit, and then you'll see stuff like Xdebug support version 2.03, and then down here you'll see all of your extended configuration options and what's turned on and what's turned off. So switching that on can be a really handy thing in sort of that debugging process, and debugging your debugger to, I don't know, trying to get this thing working. It can be tricky. So, okay, so a happy smiley face, because this is tricky. If anyone wants some help getting this set up, I have done this on a handful of systems, and I'm around through like 3 o'clock tomorrow. I'll be doing coding for a cause, and I'll be around this evening. So if you want some help trying to figure out, like, if you've tried to set this up and it's just not working, I'd be happy to look at it with you. And or my email address was up there. Shoot me an email, say, hey, this thing's not working, and maybe I can help you. I'd be happy to do that. It is my first time setting this up. I probably spent a day or more diving through everything. I hope I've simplified it a little bit, but it still can be a little bit tricky just because you have several moving pieces. So good. So we're going to talk a little bit about what step debugging is. Might have been helpful earlier, but this is where I put it. So this is from PHP Storm. Like I said, this is not a promotion of PHP Storm. I just wanted to have something in there to kind of show you what the steps are. Basically, you generally have to turn it on, and especially if you use that auto start, you're going to have this off some of the time, but you turn it on in your IDE, and that just kind of enables your IDE to be listening for Xdebug stuff. I don't understand how it all works, so that's not important. You just turn it on, and then you want to set what's called breakpoints, and that we'll actually do this in a few minutes. That's what tells, or that's how your IDE knows where to stop the execution, so you can start inspecting what's happening in your code. And then whichever IDE you have, or if you happen to use Vim and you're just using buttons, you have ways of doing a handful of things that I just wanted to talk about. The main ones, and the icons vary of course too, but this is called stepping in, and it'll make more sense when we look at it, but basically that means run the code, and if it's a function or going, well, I guess mainly if it's function, control structures in general, it will go into that function and execute the first line in it, and then step over will execute that line of code but not go inside of it. So if you're running a function, it will run the function but keep you where you currently are. That's with how many things can sometimes be running and how many function calls. You're often going to want to use a step over instead of a step in, and you kind of find that. And then there's a step, let's see, this one's step over, and then this one's step out, and that will take you back out of whatever function or control structure you are in and go to the next line. So if you're doing if you accidentally or intentionally do a step into a function, and you want to get back to the function you were in before that, up the call stack, you can do a step out, and that will get you going. And then you'll always have some kind of a play button, which will jump you to your next breakpoint, or just if there's not another breakpoint that it finds, it'll run through the rest of the execution and your page will finally finish loading. Your browser just kind of sits there at whatever point it was stuck at when you hit the first breakpoint. But you can, things will, well, nothing changed in the browser. So you just kind of stay in your IDE until that's finished. So that's kind of the general concept. The icons will look different, but you've got step in, out, over, and play are the main commands. There's other buttons on here, and I don't even know what they do. Now that one's a run to cursor, so you can stick your cursor somewhere instead of doing a breakpoint, and it'll just run straight down to there. That's it. I don't know what the other buttons on here do. I never used them. They're probably helpful to somebody. Probably be helpful to me if I knew what they were, but I never bothered to find out. So I think this will make a little bit more sense if we do it in some actual code. And so I want to do a bit of a live demo here. How much time do I have left? Is this around 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Wow. Okay. So we're not going to do much of a demo. I had some stuff to set up here, but let me just show you what that looks like then. I'm going to do it from here. I set up this demo website, which we're not going to get to use much of. But here's this page that works, and I was going to break it so we could debug it. Well, we'll just skip that. So I'm going to go over to my debugger. Here's the icon I showed you. We're going to turn it on. And then this is the page callback for my awesome page. And I'm setting a breakpoint. So now what I'm expecting to happen when I go here and refresh my page is it's going to keep spinning up in the corner because we've stopped here at this breakpoint. So now you'll see I can inspect all of my variables down here. This is a very handy little thing right here, and there's other places we won't go into all of it, but you also get a call stack on here, and that'll be the same, different in whatever IDE you're in, but variables in your call stack are two of the very handy things. So we've run to this next line here, and I can see that my output variable has been set to here. I can also set all of these other things, like look at this. I can look at my get global variable and see my path. I can look at my session variable and see, I have some kind of messages in there. So you can go through all of these things and see exactly what your what state it is, and then I'm going to do we're going to do a step into, which is this one, and then I got, where did I even jump here? Okay, we stepped into the menu. So I'm jumping around here. I'd go through it a little bit more, but I see I have 2 minutes left. So basically that's the kind of thing that you do on here, and it varies depending on what you're doing, and this can be extremely, extremely useful then for, I think I had it running from 2 different places. That's what's going on here. So I'm going to do step into that, and then I'm going to there. So I'd have to debug my presentation a little bit here. Sorry about that. But anyway, we can go through. See, now here I've landed, and it'll automatically open files for you. And I landed on here the Drupal deliver page. So now you can learn all kinds of stuff about how Drupal core is delivering pages. I can go to step over and jump around some on the site. There's my delivery callback. And pretty soon I should be, here I am at the Drupal shutdown function, which finishes up the page load. I can hit play, and I can jump back over here, and here is my awesome page. That's extremely useful. You can set a breakpoint wherever. We could spend a lot of time if we started right here in index.php and did step into. You guys would be here straight through coding for a cause, most likely, because there's a lot of lines that get run. Which brings me to my closing challenge is to get this set up, and if you're really wanting to learn how Drupal works or how a module works, it's going to take you hours and hours and hours of doing this, but take the time, get your step through debugger set up, and go line by line through whatever you're trying to understand. See what the variables are set at, see what it jumps to, You spend enough time doing this, you will understand the menu routing system, the hook system, the form system, much more than you ever wanted to. But it really is useful, and if you're trying to understand anybody else's piece of code about anything, it's great. I'll put these slides up. Here's some of the references that I used to prepare this presentation. I do a special plug for this article by Randy Fay, randyfay.com/debugging. He's got a lot more stuff on there than what I was able to cover. He's got a lot of links on there, a few other links on there that are helpful. So thank you very much for coming. If you want to get a hold of me, like I said, to try to get these things going, I'd be happy to help you. Here's my email address, my Twitter account, my website, and my name. And feel free to find me at the after party if you want to talk more, because I think we have a little, well, I guess we have a little bit of time to get to the closing session, but I know nobody wants to be late for the after party, so I don't want to keep you late here. So.